Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going deep on impartiality. And this one's especially for you, listener, because you sent us those philosophy excerpts, right? The ones from the Stanford Encyclopedia. So we know you're ready to get into the weeds on this.
It's a concept that seems pretty straightforward, but trust me, the more you dig into it, the more fascinating it gets. And yeah, those Stanford Encyclopedia entries are a great starting point.
Definitely. And one thing that jumped out is impartiality isn't always about morality.
Right, like you wouldn't want your doctor choosing your treatment based on your favorite sports team, right? You want them to be impartial to that stuff, focus on the medical facts.
Yeah, good point. So impartiality means like certain factors shouldn't influence the decision.
Exactly. It's about keeping things relevant to the goal at hand. But where it gets really interesting and complex is when we apply this to moral decisions.
Yeah, because suddenly it's not about what college someone went to. It's about like life and death choices, right?
Yeah.
Or how we distribute resources or who deserves help. Way higher stakes.
Absolutely. And that's where the philosophical questions get really juicy. Like, what does it even mean to be morally impartial? Is it about having a certain kind of viewpoint, an impartial point of view, like the encyclopedia mentions?
So if I'm trying to decide what's the right thing to do, am I supposed to imagine myself as some kind of neutral observer detached from the situation?
That's one way to think about it, but it gets tricky fast. Whose viewpoint are we talking about? And can we actually shed all our own biases and experiences to reach that view from nowhere? Some philosophers doubt it.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine being totally objective when real people are involved, people you care about or people you disagree with. It's not like math where there's just one right answer.
And that ties into another big question. Is moral impartiality all about equality? Because on the surface, they seem linked, right? But what kind of equality are we talking about?
Yeah, does it mean treating everyone exactly the same no matter what? Because that doesn't seem right either. What if someone needs more help or has different circumstances?
You've hit on a key distinction, and there's a classic example that illustrates this perfectly. William Godwin, back in the 1700s, had this thought experiment in his book Inquiry concerning political justice.
Ooh, I love a good thought experiment. Lay it on me.
Okay, so picture this. There's a fire. You can only save one person. Your choices are Archbishop Fenelon, this brilliant scholar, or just your average chambermaid. Who do you save?
Uh-oh, that's tough. Do I, like, flip a coin? Or is there some rule book for this?
Well, Godwin actually argues you should save the archbishop, and his reasoning gets to the heart of this impartiality-equality dilemma.
Wait, seriously, how does that work? Isn't that like playing favorites?
He says you got to think about the bigger picture. The archbishop, with his knowledge and influence, he'll benefit way more people than the chambermaid would. It's about maximizing the greater good, as consequentialists would put it.
I kind of see where he's coming from, but it still feels weird. Like, isn't the chambermaid's life just as valuable intrinsically? Just because she's not famous doesn't mean she matters less.
Exactly, and that's the point Godwin's getting at, though maybe not intentionally. Even if you're trying to be impartial, focusing on this greater good, you might end up overlooking the equal worth of individuals.
Okay, so even with good intentions, striving for some big picture impartiality can lead to outcomes that feel wrong on a gut level. Is that a problem specifically for consequentialism, where all that matters is the result, not the act itself?
You're catching on quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, in its purest form, consequentialism can lead to some pretty extreme conclusions. It says you got to always pick the action that leads to the best overall outcome, no matter what your personal feelings are.
So, like, if I had a choice between donating to a charity that saves, say, 5 strangers overseas, or spending that same money on a less effective treatment for my own parent who's sick,
Yeah.
consequentialism says, got to go with the 5 strangers, even if it hurts.
Yep. Even if the difference in benefit is tiny, a strict consequentialist would say, maximize good, no matter what. Tough, right?
It's super tough. And this is where people raise that demandingness objection. Like, how can anyone actually live like that? Constantly calculating the best outcome, ignoring your own feelings.
It's one of the big debates around consequentialism, but its defenders have some counter-arguments, you know? They don't just shrug and say, too bad, be more moral.
I'm all ears. How do they get around that problem?
Well, some say any truly impartial system is going to be demanding. If you're taking everyone's needs into account equally, that's going to require effort, sacrifice sometimes. It's not going to be comfy.
So it's not like consequentialism is uniquely harsh. It's just that true impartiality, no matter how you get there, is going to ask a lot of us.
Right. Another common response is maybe we overestimate how much morality should be the driving force in our lives, like there's got to be space for personal values, relationships,
Hmm.
stuff that matters to us even if it doesn't maximize the global good at every second.
That's reassuring. And wasn't that kind of Mill's point in utilitarianism? Like, he saw caring for loved ones as part of the good life, not something opposed to it.
Exactly. He had this idea that looking after those close to you often does make the world better, so it's not always this conflict between selfishness and morality.
Okay, so maybe it's not always about strangers versus family in some zero-sum game. But still, even with these more nuanced takes, consequentialism gets a lot of pushback for being too demanding. Are other moral frameworks, like deontology, any easier on us?
That's what we'll get into next time. Deontology's got a different focus. It's all about duties and rights, not just outcomes. And that can lead to different answers about how impartial we need to be and what we're allowed to prioritize in our own lives. All right, so let's get into deontology then. This is a whole different ballgame, right? Instead of just fixating on outcomes like consequentialism does, it says, hold on, there are some things that are just plain wrong, no matter how much good they might bring about.
Yeah, it's like there's some lines you just don't cross, certain principles you got to uphold, even if it means things don't work out perfectly in the end.
Exactly. And this leads to some interesting differences in how impartiality plays out. Like, remember that framing an innocent person dilemma we talked about before? Consequentialism might say, well, if framing that one person saves 100 others, do it. The ends justify the means, right?
Ugh, yeah, it's a tough one. Sacrificing one for the many always feels icky, even if the math works out.
And a deontologist would probably agree. They'd say, hold on, you're violating that innocent person's rights, their dignity, their autonomy. You can't just use them as a means to an end, even if it's a good end.
So it's like there are certain things that are off limits, even if they lead to a better outcome overall. Like everyone has a fundamental right not to be used like that, regardless of the consequences.
Precisely. And that's where this idea of universalizability comes in, which is super important for deontologists, especially Kant. It's this idea that a moral rule is only valid if it can be applied to everyone consistently without contradicting itself.
So, like, if I'm thinking of lying to get myself out of a jam, I gotta ask, would I be okay with everyone lying whenever it's convenient? Because that world sounds pretty chaotic, right? Nobody would trust each other.
Exactly. For Kant, a morally sound action is one that you could rationally will to be a universal law. That's the test. But there are other ways to think about universalizability, too.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
Well, some philosophers focus on consistency, like, am I applying the same standards to myself as I do to others? Am I being a hypocrite? Others emphasize this idea of imagining what we'd endorse if we could occupy any viewpoint, kind of stripping away our own biases. That can be really powerful, trying to see things from different perspectives.
So, even within deontology, there are different ways to think about how impartiality works.
Right.
It's not just a list of thou shalt nots. It's about the reasoning behind those rules, making sure they apply fairly to everyone.
You got it. It's about the principles, not just the specific actions.
Yeah.
And that leads us to another big framework we haven't touched yet, contractualism. It's a whole different way of thinking about where morality comes from and how impartiality fits in.
All right, I'm intrigued. Consequentialism is all about outcomes. Deontology is about duties and rights. So what's contractualism's deal?
This one's super interesting. It basically says, imagine you're setting up society from scratch. You and a bunch of other rational folks, you're going to make the rules, the moral code that everyone's going to live by. But here's the catch. You don't know who you'll be in this society.
Oh, I'm getting veil of ignorance vibes here.
Huh.
Like John Rawls' famous idea.
Exactly. You could be rich or poor, healthy or sick, talented or not. You're behind this veil that hides your future position. So Rawls argues you're going to want rules that are fair to everyone, just in case you end up being the one who needs the most help.
Makes sense. If I don't know if I'll be born a genius or struggling to get by, I'm going to want a society that supports everyone, regardless of their circumstances.
Right. Rawls thinks this leads to principles like basic liberties for all, a fair distribution of resources, things that benefit everyone in society. But of course, no theory is perfect, and there are some potential problems with this approach too.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it sounds lovely and fair in theory, but does it really capture everything that matters? Like, what about things like community, tradition, those shared values that go beyond just individual rights?
You've hit on one of the big criticisms. Some argue that Rawls's theory, while aiming for fairness, might accidentally privilege a very individualistic worldview, where it's all about protecting individual rights and maximizing personal freedom. maybe that's not the only way to build a good society.
So even if it seems neutral on the surface, the veil of ignorance might be smuggling in some assumptions about what a good life looks like, assumptions that not everyone shares.
Exactly. It raises the question of whether any theory can ever be truly neutral, or if we're always going to be bringing our own values and assumptions to the table. Which, I guess, brings us to the really big question. Can we ever be truly impartial? Like, is that even possible for us messy humans?
Man, that's the one that keeps me up at night. All these frameworks, they make sense on paper, but in the real world, it feels like impartiality is always bumping up against our emotions, our biases, our own experiences.
Right. I mean, the idea of this perfectly impartial, ideal observer, detached from all personal stuff, it can feel pretty unrealistic. Like, are we supposed to become some kind of emotionless robots to make moral judgments?
That doesn't sound very fun, or very human for that matter. And if we can become totally impartial, wouldn't we end up caring less about the people we love or the causes we believe in?
That's a worry some philosophers have raised. They say striving for this kind of absolute impartiality might actually be counterproductive. It could lead to indifference, apathy, rather than genuine moral engagement. Like, if you care about everyone equally, maybe you end up caring about no one deeply.
So what's the alternative? Are we doomed to just be biased and partial forever?
Not necessarily. There are other ways to think about impartiality that don't require us to become these emotionless robots. Amartya Sen, for example, has this idea of open impartiality. He says, instead of trying to erase our perspectives, we got to acknowledge them, but also make a conscious effort to understand and engage with views that differ from our
Oh,
own.
I like that. So it's like we all have blind spots. We all come to these issues with our own baggage. But by being open to other perspectives, by really listening to people who see things differently, we can get closer to a more well-rounded, fair way of thinking about things.
Exactly. It's about being willing to have your assumptions challenged, to step outside your comfort zone and see things from a new angle. Kind of like the philosophical version of traveling to broaden your horizons.
Ooh, love that analogy. And it reminds me of Miranda Fricker's work on testimonial justice. She talks about how important it is to truly listen to and value the voices of people who are often marginalized or dismissed.
Great connection. Both Sen and Fricker are emphasizing that impartiality isn't about shutting down your own perspective, it's about expanding it, being receptive to different ways of seeing the world.
This all ties back to that point we made earlier about how even seemingly neutral systems can be hiding certain values, right?
Mhm.
Like Rawls's veil of ignorance, it sounds super fair, but maybe it's subtly favoring a particular liberal individualistic worldview.
Exactly. It's like those optical illusions where you think you're seeing one thing, but then someone points out the trick, the way the image is designed to fool you. We got to be on the lookout for those kinds of tricks, those hidden biases, even in theories that seem neutral on the surface.
Okay, so maybe true impartiality is this ongoing project, something we got to constantly work towards, rather than a destination we can just arrive at. And maybe part of that project is acknowledging that we are partial beings. We do have these attachments and biases.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what's often framed as the partialist versus impartialist debate. This is the big one, right? The age-old question of whether it's okay to give preferential treatment to the people we love, to prioritize our own communities, even if it means others might lose out.
Yeah, this is where things get really personal, really real. It's not just abstract philosophy anymore. It's about how we live our lives, who we choose to help, how we balance those competing demands of caring for ourselves and caring for others.
It cuts to the core of what it means to be a moral person in this messy, complicated world of human relationships. And that's what we'll dive into next time.
This whole partiality thing makes me think about those debates about animal rights, Like how far does our circle of moral concern extend?
It's a great connection because, yeah, the partialist versus impartialist debate, it's not just about humans, right? It gets us thinking about our obligations to all kinds of beings.
So if someone says, hey, it's okay to prioritize my family over strangers because we have this special bond, this shared history, does that same logic apply to, say, prioritizing your pet over a stray animal?
That's where things get really interesting and where the different justifications for partiality start to pull in different directions. Like if you focus on individual qualities, things like sentience, the capacity to suffer, then species membership might not be the deciding factor.
So if I see a stray dog that's clearly in a lot of pain, maybe I do have a stronger obligation to help it, even over my own cat who's chilling at home, spoiled rotten.
Right. Because in that case, the dog's need is greater, its suffering is more intense, and those factors might outweigh the special bond I have with my cat. That's kind of the line that consequentialists like Peter Singer take. They say expand the moral circle, include all beings who can feel, who can experience joy and pain.
But if the argument for partiality is all about the relationship itself, the shared history, the emotional connection, then things get a lot murkier when we're talking about different species.
For sure, because some people would say, look, we humans, we've got this shared humanity, a kind of moral kinship that creates special obligations to each other that we don't necessarily have to animals.
So it's like saying, yeah, all lives have value, but I've got a greater duty to help, say, my distant cousin than a stranger on the street, even if that stranger needs help more urgently just because of the family connection.
Exactly. And this view, it often gets labeled speciesism, kind of like racism or sexism, where you're giving preferential treatment based on an arbitrary characteristic.
But those who hold this view, they wouldn't see it as prejudice, right? They'd say it's about recognizing the unique moral significance of human relationships, the shared experiences, the capacity for empathy and understanding that we have with each other.
Right. It's not just about favoritism. It's about acknowledging the special bonds that arise from our shared history, our culture, our ability to communicate and reason with each other in complex ways. It's a tangled web, for sure, and there are no easy answers.
Man, this deep dive has really been something else. We started with impartiality, this seemingly simple idea, but it's taken us down all these fascinating paths, from ancient thought experiments to modern ethical dilemmas, animal rights, the whole shebang.
And that's the thing about philosophy, right? It's not about finding the right answer. It's about asking the right questions, the ones that make us think harder, challenge our assumptions, and help us navigate this complex world a little bit better.
Absolutely. So, listener, we're throwing this back to you. After all this, what are your takeaways? What arguments resonated with you, and which ones made you go, hold on, not so fast?
Yeah, and how can you apply all this to your own life? Where do you tend to lean on the partiality spectrum? And are there ways to become more aware of those leanings, those biases, so you can make decisions that are more fair, more just, more aligned with your values?
These are the big questions, the ones that stick with you long after the deep dive is over.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it's not just about understanding these ideas intellectually, it's about putting them into practice, using them to live a more thoughtful, ethical, and meaningful life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So
Yeah.
keep questioning, keep exploring, keep those philosophical gears turning.
And until next time, keep diving deep, everyone.